no question about that, make the world a better place. But then we also have to have the guardrails, the governance at all levels, right? The municipal, the state, you know, the federal and the international levels. So it would appear to me that the states should be regulating under the rubric of a federal kind of structure. And Biden and Harris put out a great executive order. You know, they had Ben Buchanan, they had some great advisors helping them with that. That's all gone now. Mm-hmm. And so kind of when you got a J.D. Vance, you know, who was one of Peter Thiel's boys, kind of at the helm, the floodgates are a little wider, more widely open now to allow developments to occur with a little bit less governance.
Right, there was just an action summit in Paris, right, in February, right, where it was basically the message from the U.S. was hands off in terms of regulation.
Drill, baby, drill, right? So. Mm-hmm.
So perhaps some kind of international agency, but unlikely to have sort of individual national agencies or some sort of collective group that might look at this. And really, is it needed if all the big players are in the U.S. anyway?
You know, that's a great question. They still need governance, because what is going to save us is essentially a kind of a Hobbesian framework. Thomas Hobbes put forward the notion of a social contract. So what we have to do is get together, draft up an agreement, and say, okay, here's how we're going to move forward. We all agree to what's written on this piece of paper, and this is enforceable by a particular type of agency or governing body. And we have to be open, we have to be transparent, we have to be collaborative, and we have to cooperate. Because if we don't grow up very quickly in terms of our ethical and legal frameworks, it could turn out to be very, very bad. So if we cooperate and agree that, yep, we're all going to try to get the very best that it can offer and limit the very worst that could possibly happen, all the boats rise. Everybody does better. The rich get richer, the poor get richer. You know, everything will tend to go in our favor. But if we get a couple of bad actors who decide they want more than the next, you know, country or company or whatever, that could really mess things up for the rest of us.
You know, I want to end the show in the last minute or so here with you telling us why we need this. What is the big benefit? I know we briefly mentioned some of the medical advances that we might see, but in your book, you talk very specifically about some potential mental health benefits for autistic people to communicate, pancreatic cancer diagnoses. Like, tell me one or two big ones in the last minute here that some folks might say, you know what, it's worth it to continue to pursue this and think about this kind of regulation, because it does do real, tangible things that can help people. What are they?
It does, for sure. Let's just look at education, right? And look at how taxed teachers are, right? I mean, they've got such a difficult job. How can we make their job easier? Well, we can use AI to test and analyze each student, determine what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and then have the AI develop systems for educational learning tools that will facilitate their understanding, and they will simply learn better. Then the teacher, you let the teachers do what they do best, teach, right? Mm-hmm. And they can do so according to those programs, those independent educational programs that AI will help facilitate, as well as things like grading and, you know, the very mundane stuff that takes up so much of their time.
Real educational benefits, quicker medical diagnoses, all sorts of things that are yet to be seen, but we also want to make sure that we regulate. Christopher DiCarlo, philosopher, author, and ethicist, thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I'm Deborah Becker. This is On Point.
This episode of On Point is supported by a grant from the John Templeton Foundation.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from Seed. Seed's DSO1 is a 24-strain 2-in-1 probiotic and prebiotic engineered to survive digestion, support healthy regularity, and promote whole body health. Learn more at seed.com/public. And BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy. Clients are matched with one of 30,000 therapists and can communicate via video, chat, or phone at betterhelp.com/public.
KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham. It's almost noon. Coming up, the show is called Week in Review. The host is called Bill Radke.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here with a journalist and a former state governor candidate and Port of Seattle commissioner and a former state legislator, where the legislation is happening right now. The legislature in Olympia is trying to figure out who we're going to tax and how we're going to spend. I can't imagine how these people are. How do I get them to sit still in a studio for an hour while the exciting stuff's happening in Olympia?
The whole city is clamoring.
The whole city's on fire. We'll discuss all that, Olympia, and other news of the week if you'll just stay tuned.
Support for KUOW comes from Carter Subaru, Seattle, with locations in Ballard and Shoreline, offering over 400 new vehicles in stock and ready for delivery, with options to shop in-store or online. More at cartersubaru.com, Seattle's only Subaru dealer. Love the Moth stories on the radio? See them live. Join the Moth for a special main stage event and experience 5 captivating stories live. That's Thursday, May 22nd at 7:30 p.m. at Benaroya Hall in Seattle. Find out more and get your tickets at kuow.org/events.
Support for KUOW comes from Evidence-Based Treatment Centers of Seattle, science-based therapy for complex problems provided by specialists, personally tailored, outpatient and intensive treatment for all ages in the anxiety, DBT, and eating disorders centers. More at ebtseattle.com.
It is 64 degrees in South Seattle. Mostly sunny is the forecast for today with an expected high of 71. Tonight, a low of 48 under a clear sky. Saturday, sunny with a high of 68. Sunday, partly sunny with a high of 63, and then a chance of rain enters the forecast Monday and Tuesday. 12:01.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. In a major reversal, the federal government is restoring the legal status of more than 1,000 international students whose visas it had moved to cancel in recent weeks, according to a lawyer representing the plaintiffs in one of the cases. The database that tracks whether student visa holders are complying with the terms of their visas include recording any disciplinary action or criminal charges against the students. Well, in order for their visas to remain valid, students' records must remain active. However, ICE had begun abruptly terminating hundreds of records in recent weeks, often without notifying students or their schools. Attorney General Pam Bondi is defending the arrest of a Wisconsin judge accused of helping a Mexican defendant in her court thwart immigration authorities who are searching for him.
I think some of these judges think they are beyond and above the law, and they are not. And we're sending a very strong message today. If you are harboring a fugitive, we don't care who you are. If you are helping hide one, if you are giving a TDA member guns, anyone who is illegally in this country, we will come after you and we will prosecute you.
Bondi speaking on Fox after the arrest of Milwaukee Circuit Court Judge Hannah Dugan. And a former New Mexico judge and his wife were also arrested yesterday on charges they aided a Venezuelan gang member. White House envoy Steve Witkoff has wrapped up talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. NPR's Charles Maines has details from Moscow.
Putin and Witkoff met for 3 hours of talks that Kremlin advisor Yuri Shakov later characterized as constructive and useful. Yushakov said positions on Ukraine and other international issues had grown closer as a result. Yet at least for now, it appears Witkoff failed to get Russian support for the U.S.-backed peace plan. Critics of the U.S. proposal said it overwhelmingly favors Moscow in recognizing Russia's hold over territories it seized from Ukraine by force. Instead, Russia raised the possibility of direct talks with Ukraine while agreeing to more active dialogue with the U.S. Trump had been threatening to walk away from peace efforts in Ukraine entirely if he didn't see immediate progress. Charles Maines, NPR News, Moscow.
The president signed an executive order aimed at making it easier for mining companies to dig for minerals on the ocean floor. Here's NPR's Julia Simon.
Deep on the ocean floor are potato-sized nodules that contain metals like nickel, cobalt, manganese, and copper. These metals can be used in technologies like batteries. The executive order instructs federal departments to expedite the process for reviewing and issuing permits for mining on the seafloor. Scientists and environmental groups are already condemning the order, arguing that opening the deep seabed for mining could damage important marine ecosystems. Underwater mining involves giant machines and creates plumes of sediment that could suffocate marine life. That can have serious impacts on and disrupt the fishing industry.
It's NPR.
This is KUOW News. I'm Kevin Kniestead in Seattle. Changes to Washington's parents' rights law are heading back to the governor's desk. Olympia correspondent Jeannie Lindsay reports.
The changes revise the state's parents' rights law, which was enacted as a voter initiative last year. The bill also adds new rights for students and creates a new complaint and enforcement process for schools that violate those regulations.
It is several bad proposals bolted together.
That's Republican Representative Jim Walsh, who sponsored last year's Parents' Rights Initiative. He and other critics say changes will further erode trust in public schools. But Democrats say LGBTQ students need stronger protections. Representative Monica Stonier sponsored this year's bill.
I continue to hear from students and their parents concerns they have about their safety from bullying, intimidation, and discrimination in school.
The bill passed along party lines. I'm Jeannie Lindsay in Olympia.
The Seattle Times is reporting a number of international students who recently had their visas revoked by the Trump administration are getting their statuses reinstated. The paper says the about face is affecting at least 8 students at the University of Washington and 1 from Seattle University. No explanation yet for the reversals, and there's no word of any other students getting their visas reinstated. Several international students recently filed lawsuits against the federal government, claiming it unfairly revoked their legal status. The Trump administration has targeted at least 35 students and recent graduates at 7 universities in Washington state. And the Mariners are back home for tonight's 6:40 game against the Miami Marlins. The M's beat the Red Sox yesterday 4-3 and wrapped things up with the team's first series win in Boston in 11 years. They're now tied for the lead in the AL West. This is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Indiana University, establishing the IU Launch Accelerator for Biosciences to drive healthcare discoveries and train the next generation of innovators. More at go.iu.edu/IULab.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke, and we review the week because that's the title of the show. We feel like we probably ought to live up to that. We discuss, we debate what's going on this week locally, and we have with us a former member of the Washington State House and Senate, founder of Earth Finance, Reuven Carlyle is here. Reuven, how are you not glued to some kind of live stream or something? There's probably not, right? The legislature's doing its thing behind closed doors.
There's lots of live streaming.
Oh, yeah?
But you know what? Once you leave public office, it's nice to be at a different altitude. Keep an eye on it and engage and be intellectually curious, but not sit there and overly pay too much attention.
Can I bring you back to the too much attention altitude just for an hour?
Sure.
Okay, good. We've got the Cascade PBS podcast producer, Maleeha Syed, with us. Again, welcome back, Maleeha.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you. And third, we have a former Port of Seattle commissioner, now columnist for the Tacoma Tribune and the Spokane Inlander, Bill Bryant. You also ran for governor. Are you super excited that Olympia is buzzing trying to get to the end of this legislative session?
I hope they get to the end of the session. I don't know that I'm super excited about what's happening down there.
Will you discuss with me for the next
why
hour?
not?
Okay. And by the way, that's all happening on YouTube, so you can watch us be excited. Topic number 1, as I suggested, what are we doing here, Washington State? Who are we going to tax? Where are we going to not spend so much money? Our legislature's deciding that. Our governors must be deciding what to sign. Reuven, Carlyle, I'll start with you. What's the number one thing our listeners should know about what Olympia is up to right now?
People have been pretty aware of a pretty substantial operating budget deficit. And so all session, the governor, the House, the Senate, the internal sausage making has all been about struggling through that. And
something like a $14 billion planning
and
shortfall.
Candidly, the numbers have ranged. I mean, there hasn't been agreement on that exactly because, of course, we have an obligation that it has to be looked at over 4 years. So for that 4-year number, 12, $16 billion range. But ultimately, that's been the number one issue. And so they do have consensus. Looks like there's a deal in the legislature. They're scheduled to get out of session on Sunday, which they'll make. And you also have a transportation budget. And that's
a separate budget from the
separate budget, totally. And everyone knows the issues of ferries and roads and bridges and traffic. And so that's a whole factor. And then, of course, you got a handful of big policy bills, rent control, gun safety, a ton of other bills. So that's been, that's the top line is a bunch of activity. And remember, it's a citizen legislature. So real people living real lives go down there, do their best for 105 days and hopefully go home.
Yeah, you used to be one of those people. Bill, you just heard Reuven not choose a top story. He just gave us an overview of what's happening. So do you want to pick a number one? This is what listeners need to know about what their legislature is doing.
Yeah, they need to know there's no deficit.
Okay, so this is the.
I agree with Reuven that if you look at the numbers, and I'll use the numbers from the Ways and Means Committee staff, which are nonpartisan. They get them from the Office of Financial Management. We're looking at about a $7.7 billion budget for this biennium. If you do it over 4 years, Reuven's right. It's somewhere between 12 and 16. But that assumes that we are going to pay for everything Governor Inslee wanted to pay for. And we don't have to.
No, right.
Our taxes have gone up 113%. Our revenues have gone up 113% in the last 6 or 7 years. Spending has gone up 128%. So it's not like we have a revenue problem. We're spending a huge amount of money, spending more than we are collecting.
But you're assuming we shouldn't spend more.
No, we shouldn't, because let's look at what's driving this $7 billion deficit. For the most part, it's collective bargaining agreements. Over the last
what should people get paid?
Oh, no. Over the last 7 years, it's not just how much we're paying each individual employee. The payroll has ballooned. Yeah. And the last year alone, state payroll went up 5%. Population went up 1%. Yeah. It's growing much faster than the population is growing. And that, combined with very generous compensation packages, is giving us this 7.7. Governor Inslee negotiated these very generous packages as he was leaving the building.
Yeah.
And what the legislature needs to do is go back and renegotiate those contracts, and you will watch this deficit disappear.
Right. Okay. So the labor force would say the old contracts were not generous enough, but I know you're not agreeing.
And all but one county, state employees now make more than the average income of people in that county.
Okay, so that's your metric,
and that's not counting the very generous retirement and health care plans that they receive.
Maleeha, you and I are not the experts. These two, they've been in the trenches. What are you thinking about, asking about regarding this session?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm curious about, one thing that caught my eye when I was reading a little bit in the Seattle Times, this is so speculative, but Governor Bob Ferguson is talking about a wealth tax, and he's not really willing to pass, it sounds like, a really broad sweeping wealth tax, and he's opting for a smaller one. I guess that surprises me just because he reads to me as very progressive, very liberal. My assumption is he
because he sued Trump so many times, or some other reason? Because he has a D by his name?
He kind of has the D by his name. He kind of I think appeals to, or is perceived as left-leaning. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. And also if you could explain the wealth tax a little bit, what that could look like.
Me?
Good question.
Well, what does the wealth tax look like? Who knows? I guess in theory, the state is going to tax the assets of a Washington state citizen, regardless of whether those assets are in the state or the United States or abroad. How Washington state would...
Is this stocks and bonds? And
stocks and bonds and properties and businesses and whatever goes into your portfolio that defines your wealth.
Yeah.
Well, one, how is the state of Washington ever going to get that. We don't even declare our wealth on our federal income taxes. So how are they going to get that information? What kind of a bureaucracy, an intrusive bureaucracy, would you need to get it? And by the way, third, what authority does the state of Washington have to tax your assets in a different state? I mean, the reason why I think the governor doesn't want to base a budget on this is because he knows the minute it passes, it's going to be in the courts and it's likely to be thrown out. And then what do? Then you have to call everybody back to Olympia and redo the budget. He doesn't want to do that.
Yeah, that's helpful to
So
know.
he said he might go along with a mini tax to float to see, is this wealth tax going to stand up or not?
Yeah, I think the message was pretty clear that Microsoft in particular, but a number of the tech companies had a very big issue with the wealth tax. And a number of other companies had a very big issue with the payroll tax. So in the final budget deal and taxes, you see a reliance on the business and occupation tax. So the wealth tax and the payroll tax have not made it into the final deal, both for the legal issues, but also the reliability of the actual revenues to come in the door. So as they get ready for these final 72 hours and wrapping it up, there's also some very dubious taxes on the issue of sales tax extended to services, which is accounting for a couple of $2 billion over the 4 years. And I think that potentially has a real legal problem. And I'm just speculating here. I have no inside intel, but my instincts are that the governor could even potentially veto that only because of the really dubious legal questions about the viability of that particular tax.
So if he vetoed expanding the sales tax, that would mean more taxes someplace else or more spending
Well,
cuts.
you would have to call everybody back and write another budget.
And I'm not trying to start rumors. I'm just saying that I think instinctively there's an issue there that could be a really substantive legal challenge.
But beyond the constitutionality of some of these business and occupation and increased sales taxes, which are being floated, there's the issue that I would think, or at least hope, is going through the governor's mind, and that's that he ran largely on a platform to reduce the cost of living. Well, increasing sales taxes, increasing taxes on business and services that are likely to be passed on to people is not going to reduce our cost of living.
So you're demanding an income tax instead.
I am telling you, we need to look at this budget that has grown over 130% and begin to bring it more in line with the income that we're receiving from existing taxes.
Okay. Oh, anything else? That was a no. I have more Olympia stuff I want to talk about.
Can I throw in one more? I don't think people know. This where we talk a lot about, this is what are they doing with estate taxes or capital gains taxes, right? But they're also
property
proposing
taxes. Are they going to lift the cap on that?
Can we chat about that for 1 second?
Okay.
But also, just to bring it really down, they're talking about increasing the price of a Discover Pass by 50%. So it's not just, hitting people who might open up a residency in Florida instead. There's a lot of these are going to hit people who live right here and want to go out and hike this summer.
So you want an income tax? Is that what I'm hearing?
You keep saying that, and I keep telling you we don't have a deficit. We've got some structural payroll issues, and we need to deal with those before we talk about any new taxes. But the one that we do need to talk about, and could be a segment. It's most of the property tax increase, my understanding, Reuven, has been set aside except for allowing school levies to go up by 3%, which is going to hurt the most rural and poor school districts in the state. You're going to have a situation where the wealthy districts are going to be able to raise their property taxes a little bit with their levies and be able to get much more money per student. Poor and rural districts are going to have to raise them to the cap. They still won't raise as much. You're going to have fewer resources available to poor and rural kids, and this will bring on McCleary 2.0.
Okay.
It is somewhere between, negligent and pernicious.
But your spending reduction ideas also mean some people have less money too, right?
This payroll has gotten out of control, and
Okay.
it will. If we don't deal with it now, Bill, it's a driver. It will only get worse. It's going to continue to grow, and we've got to be able to live within.
It will only
our
get
means. worse,
or if you're the person getting the money, it will only get better. Okay, Reuven, did we cover it before we talk Tesla?
We can talk transportation as well. I would note that we have a transportation budget that is being approved as well. And I would say I will say that that's the one area where you do see much more of a bipartisan approach. In the Senate, Senator Curtis King, the ranking Republican, works with Senator Marco Lias very closely. They've got a bipartisan deal. They negotiated with the House and sounds like did a good job overall. about a 6-cent gas tax increase with a slight index to inflation. But that's for maintenance and preservation. That's for maintaining our roads. So traffic reduction, and as well as some of the investments in ferries from the Climate Commitment Act and other areas. So ultimately, that's a really important reflection of the fact that there is some degree of bipartisanship that continues.
Okay, thank goodness. I did a word search in this bill, this tax on electric vehicle emission credits. I don't think the word Tesla is in the bill, right? It's just, so here's the deal, because some people are calling it a Tesla tax, understandably. Our state has an EV incentives policy, basically, that has channeled millions of dollars to Tesla because the car makers that make gas cars have to pay emissions credits to companies that make more EVs, which primarily is Tesla. Now the state is talking about taxing those credits that Tesla is getting. Now you could just say, well, we just said the legislature's looking for money, whether they should or not, Bill. But
they're always looking for money.
Okay, but but some people see a different motive here. The Washington Policy Center researcher told the Seattle Times, quote, "What Donald Trump is doing to Harvard, this bill does to Tesla." In other words, in effect, singling out one company, which has often been decried when Trump is doing it, and political retribution, which again is a charge laid at Donald Trump's feet often. Is this EV emissions tax, is it still going to happen, do you think? And if it does, is it political retribution to single out Elon Musk's company?
I do think it's going to happen. And let's be really clear. There's two issues on the issue of selling electric vehicles in the state. One is the opportunity to have direct sales. So you can have stores in our state where you walk in and you test drive and then buy a car. Tesla's the only electric vehicle company that has that authorization. That's because the auto dealerships are very powerful and are really opposed to what they call direct sales. So I was the author of legislation in 2014 to authorize electric vehicle sales and had to compromise to allow only one company. So that is a very important issue because it has generated a lot of additional sales for Tesla. The second policy comes from Representative Joe Fitzgibbon, who's now the majority leader of the House. And of 147 legislators, he's in the top of the smartest folks in Olympia. He's really, really capable.
We'll be the judge of that.
He wrote, according to me, he wrote the Clean Fuel Standard bill with former Governor Jay Inslee. And that bill does generate these incentives for electric vehicles and other non-traditional fossil fuel vehicles. So the policy itself is working, and it has worked, and it has resulted in tens of millions of dollars of credits and thus direct dollars to Tesla. I do think I have the luxury of not needing to worry about the mechanics of the budget anymore. But so from my position, I think it is deeply philosophically inconsistent to then tax those benefits. So I sort of agree with the Republicans and sort of agree with the Washington Policy Center on the mechanics of that particular issue. I think the premise of your question is right, that it does seem like it is taxing a policy that is working extremely well because we see an opportunity to tax it. Okay. At the same time, I can understand with the reality of the times we're living in and the challenges financially of, making choices like that. So I'm not above a little philosophical inconsistency on occasion as well.
Fair.
To clarify, so this would exclusively affect Tesla because it's the only company that can with direct sale authorization, or would it affect other companies that produce EVs?
It does affect all of them, but it's just that they generate so much credits because they have incremental sales.
Okay.
They have very high success sales rates in our states, or they did until probably 5 months ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Bill?
Let's call it a red letter day because Reuven and I are agreeing here.
Okay.
You've got a program that is working. And because it's working, we're going to start taxing it, which might reduce its effectiveness as a policy, which is what we don't want. We want to increase sales of EVs. So why are we now making it more difficult? I mean, why aren't we just taking off the sales tax on all EVs if we want people to buy them?
Well, you mentioned Joe Fitzgibbon. I'll give you some of the reasons he cited. Number one, he used the word outlier. And this might have been a Seattle Times quote. I want to give credit. I'm not sure who all he spoke to. But an outlier that they're making so much. Again, that doesn't really change the argument we just had. He says that the federal government has revoked huge amounts of federal dollars for EV infrastructure. So I'm not sure, is he saying EVs have gotten less important to incentivize because the federal government's not going to pay for charging stations? I'm not quite sure. And finally, he says, he asked the Seattle Times, is it serving the interest of the public for this asset to be untaxed? And I guess that we kind of already addressed that. Didn't you say that it served the public interest when you passed the law, and maybe before you didn't like Elon Musk? But that's mind reading. I don't know what's in Joe's mind. I don't know Joe. I just called him Joe.
Well, he's the best. I will say, though, that you can see us. This is sort of one of those dynamics where the optics certainly don't look great regardless. But as you said, if you take some of that money and you plow it back into building additional electric vehicle infrastructure statewide, maybe there's a better public benefit.
There's a rationale. Right?
Yeah, exactly. But if it's just going to go into the general fund and who knows how it's being spent, then we've just created another tax on a successful program.
Yeah. Okay. Couple of quick things before we take a break. It looks like the state's going to limit how much landlords can raise rents each year. Something like 10% or maybe 7% plus inflation, whichever's lower. But I think they're taking the exemption for single-family homes, which is a big deal. Right? A lot of people renting out their home, as I have done, not in this state, but a different one. I did that once. They're saying basically and there's also was an exemption for new construction for 50. If you're building something new, you don't have to pay this. You don't have to deal with this rent cap for 15 years. Now they're saying, well, maybe only 12 years. So they're negotiating. But the bottom line is some landlords are saying this is going to drive so many of them out of the market that rents will actually rise. Any takes on that?
As a Seattle renter who's had my rent increase, hundreds over the past few years, I empathize a lot with landlords who are dealing with rising costs and costs to create housing or offer housing. But I know people who have been priced out of Seattle because their rent is raised. And so while I don't know what the solution is for a landlord, as a renter, I think a rent cap makes a lot of sense because cost of living has increased across the board, and rent for me is the largest expense. And I just couldn't imagine what a landlord would do to alternately make money. I'm not sure if there are other alternatives, but I think the burden on the renter is dire, and it increases significantly every year.
Well, we need more housing, so let's not do anything which reduces the inventory of housing. I think they're trying to deal with that by excluding new construction.
Yeah.
But if you have an older building that's, let's say, got 30 units and it needs upgrades, are you going to upgrade it if now you can't raise the rent to accommodate that improvement cost? I mean, you could have a situation where assets begin to deteriorate, or what will happen is the landlords won't let their assets deteriorate. They'll just sell them. And then whether or not that remains a rental facility or not is up in the air. We got to be very careful that we're not moving and trying to do something to help people who are renting. Let's make sure we don't do something which reduces the housing inventory in the city.
Yeah, KUOW listeners are so smart and well-dressed. They know the reality of this topic. It's complex. It's difficult. Look, the city of Seattle voters keep voting for virtually every property tax increase. That gets passed on directly. There's issues around inflation and repairs. And so at the same time, Senator Shoemake from Bellingham is an economist professor at Western. She was the swing vote that really flipped this issue as a Democrat to say, hey, wait a minute, I don't think from a policy point of view that any type of rent control really is shown to be effective, but hugely popular among the public, as you said, relative to real people living real lives having some degree of cap. So you can see the politics and the policy tension relative to, is there a small cap that can work? Does it grow with inflation? Do you carve out people? So it looks pretty messy in terms of some kind of final compromise. As a general statement, the extremes in this area, I think, are shown to be pretty ineffective. If you have absolute chaos and you don't have sufficient supply, you're not going to see the increase in housing availability. If you put artificial constraints like New York City or San Francisco, you see complete chaos where rents are held for 30 years and no one invests in the quality of that housing. So,
well, I want to point out to our listeners that I think we just heard the assertion that more units being available reduces the cost of housing, because I can tell you that I hear from people, including some KUOW listeners, who deny that and say because they don't want more density, and so they'll say all this density is not making housing cheaper, but you're saying that it does, that more housing does make housing cheaper.
I think it's an evidence-based best practice. I think there's a lot of evidence and peer-reviewed, academically valid studies that show that housing availability and is incredibly important, and from a supply point of view, to bring down price.
Okay. Finally, before we leave Olympia, does anyone have anything to say about this requirement that the gun buyers have to apply for a 5-year permit, pay a fee, and take a safety course?
Go ahead. No? Yeah, I've got some issues with it. And I don't want to get into the Second Amendment constitutional issues, although I think there are some very serious constitutional issues. This requires you to go to a class to get a permit, and then you have to renew that permit every 5 years. If you don't, and I haven't seen the final language, so I don't know if this is still in there, but originally there was language in there, maybe it's still in, saying that if you don't renew your permit, the sheriff can come and take your guns. That's got some pretty serious Second Amendment issues.
Is that different from other states? Because some other
only
states...
other state that has anything like this is Colorado, and it's the challenge is getting ready. Now,
it's in the courts.
When you step back and say, what is wrong with having to go to a one-day gun safety course? I mean, I would probably benefit from going to a one-day course. Being required to do it by the government doesn't sit particularly well with me, but I also don't think this is going to accomplish the objective, and that's the biggest problem I have with it. In the press, it's been reported that the proponents of this bill are arguing that it's going to cut down gun-related deaths, with no evidence for that at all. Because in Washington state, over 65% of our gun-related deaths are suicide. And most of those are white males over 34. Most of those are men over 54. These people do not have a problem going to a class and getting a gun if they want one. For the most part, they already have one. What we need to be doing in this state is not making everybody go to a class and get a piece of paper, because that's not going to keep somebody from committing suicide. What we need to do is fix our mental health system. And what I don't think enough people know in this state is that when you rank the states by mental health, and this is Mental Health America, this is a nonprofit, does mental health policies across the country. Washington state for adult mental health is rated 31 out of 50. For youth mental health, we're 48 out of 50.
Okay.
For prevalence, we're 49 out of 50. We have a broken mental health system.
Yeah.
And if we're really serious about dealing with the gun-related deaths and suicide, we need to be investing in our mental health system.
But since not all of these deaths are suicides, does anybody dispute Bill's take on the efficacy of a gun permit requirement?
I do, very much so. I mean, look, the Alliance for Gun Responsibility is the premier advocacy group in our state, very well regarded. They've run a number of citizens initiatives, all of which have passed. This policy, as I understand it, is in place in 12 other states. And the essence of it is, of course, you have to get permit and training before you purchase a weapon. I just don't think that that's radical and extreme relative to outlier requirements. And I think it's basic. I think it is incredibly constructive to have that time to make sure the training is there. And we always use the example of driving a car. You got to have a license. You have to have insurance. You have to have the ability to prove your ability to drive safely. I know there's
no
inherently
right to drive
of
a
course,
car.
there's inherently an important consideration relative to constitutionality. But there is an important analogy in terms of civic society. And I think having training and a permit in advance of purchasing a weapon is completely aligned with the values of most of the voters as well as the elected representatives in Washington state, as we've seen from the work that the Alliance for Gun Responsibility has done.
Right now, if I want to go up to Walmart and buy a shotgun, I can't do it unless I have a permit. and I've got to go online and I have to take this test and then I can download my permit. So we have that right now. What this is requiring is for us all to go to a class and sit in a class. Now, who's going to teach this class? Is it going to be state employees? Are we going to be hiring more state employees? Are these going to be SEIU or some sort of public employees union? So we're actually going to then be taking our tax dollars to go sit in a class with more public employees.
Is that what this is about?
No, it's not entirely what it's about, but it's not what it's not about. That this is a great way to launder money into unions that then end up in the campaign funds of legislative and gubernatorial Democratic candidates.
Anyone want to respond to that? Okay. Have we covered Olympia? Because it's a lot, and it affects so many of us. And the session is supposed to end on Sunday. And you think it's going to happen? It's going to end. And so by next week, we're going to. You all won't be here, unfortunately. I mean, I'm happy the next panel will be here, but I'll be with them telling listeners what.
And it's going to take you weeks to unravel and look at the fine print, right? That is the reality of it, right? Is that the deals get done in the last 48 hours.
What about that, by the way? How do you feel about that? I mean, so many. In fact, I have a quote. I'm not sure I'm going to find it, but I think it was a Republican. Someone saying, "This is a breach of trust that so many of bills have been introduced so late, and there's not enough time for public input, and it all happens so fast." And that sounded kind of right to me. But what do you all think?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think people have such a limited attention span. And I think when you kind of get down to the wire, people start to tune out once you're at the end of a legislative session. I'm sure that's not the case for everyone, but I would think a lot flies under the radar by that point.
It does. But remember, former coach Pete Carroll, who we all still adore, used to say, can you win a football game in the first quarter, second quarter, or third quarter? No, you can only win it in the fourth quarter. And that's the way legislating is. It's a 105-day session. The end of it is when the deals all come together. And it does take a while to read the fine print on hundreds and hundreds or thousands of pages of bills. But the main issues, we've done a fundamental reform of our recycling program. Massive bill in terms of recycling reform. The gun safety law, the Tesla bill that we talked about, but also rent control and all these other policies and bills. We'll sort of deconstruct them as the session wraps up. But, a $70 billion
striking workers
budget.
Get unemployment.
Striking workers. I mean, there's
up to 6 weeks of unemployment.
4 weeks. I thought.
Oh, is it 4? Sorry, my bad. There's a lot of deal making. So you're buying that bill? I mean, since you're not necessarily reading the best intentions. Now I feel like I'm the suspicious one and thinking this sounds pretty strategic to me that we don't get a lot of public input on this because it's all happening at the end, despite Pete Carroll.
Well, Reuven's right. You win the game in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, okay.
But what I don't like, and I think a lot of people in Olympia don't like, is that many of the people who will be voting on this won't have a full appreciation of what's in the package and what they're voting on.
Right.
They'll largely defer to budget negotiators and leadership. And that's, can't we just take a few more days and let everybody understand what they're voting on before we vote? But, the time kills deals. So
if we took a few more days, then the deadline would be a few more days later. We'd be doing all of this the same 48 hours beforehand. Okay, we got to take a break. We just getting started on the week in review because we got more to say. More stuff happened. We will debate and consider after this break.
Support for KUOW comes from Eco Design and Maintenance, family-owned and specializing in start-to-finish exterior design using materials and methods that help to reduce environmental impact. From landscapes to hardscaping, outdoor spaces designed to be functional and long-lasting. More at eco-seattle.com.
Looking for the latest headlines or a new podcast that sparks your curiosity? Then you've come to the right place. KUOW is your spot for trusted news and hyper-local programming that broadens conversations and deepens understanding. Discover more from KUOW. Download the KUOW app to listen anytime and anywhere.
Support for KUOW's car donation program comes from local Kia dealers. The Kia Niro Hybrid combines crossover versatility with hybrid performance, getting an EPA estimated 53 miles per gallon. More at kia.com.
You are watching KUOW's Week in Review if you're taking advantage of the cameras here in the room and the YouTube streaming. But even if you're listening, I think it's a pretty good listen with Cascade PBS podcast producer Maleeha Syed and former state representative and state senator Reuven Carlyle and former Port of Seattle Commissioner Bill Bryant. And I'm Bill Radke, talking about the week of news. The organizers of the Seattle Pride Festival and the Seattle Pride Parade say that those are separate organizations. They say their budgets in both cases have shrunk because of some of their corporate sponsors, unnamed so far, are giving, it looks like they're giving less money this year. The Seattle Pride executive director told the Seattle Times that these companies might be following the lead of the anti-queer, anti-DEI Trump administration. Do you think that's safe to assume?
I think that it is safe to assume that there are, if not direct, maybe indirect ramifications of the current administration's policies. So in some of the reporting, one of the obvious examples is that companies have rolled back their DEI efforts, and now a few of them seem like they're not committing.
Boeing, Amazon, Starbucks.
Yes, and Starbucks actually, I think, did commit at some point to one of the Pride festivals. But alternatively, I don't quote me on that.
No one heard that.
No one heard that. Yeah, wipe that. Alternatively, though, it seems like some companies are also just preemptively anxious. They're anticipating a recession. They're anticipating budget shortfalls with the Trump administration. So it might not be directly related to DEI policies, but it could be directed to the federal administration's policies overall.
Right.
And it's not
money's tight.
Money's tight. And it's not that companies are necessarily saying flat out no. I think The Stranger reported they kind of tracked who was signing on, and it seems like in a lot of ways they're just sort of holding off, and these Pride festivals anticipated more by this point. So they have maybe a month or so until they can hit that deadline, commit to sponsoring, but more would have done it by now, and this year feels different.
Could these companies, even if these companies were reacting to the Trump administration's take, couldn't they just give anonymously if it's so important to them to support the LGBTQ community, but maybe they don't want their name on it, but here's money because we love what you're doing?
This is kind of the hot take, is I think a lot of queer affinity organizations have pointed out that it's such a trope for big corporate companies to really get behind and rally behind a cause when it's popular. And then the joke is like July 1st comes and they drop all the rainbows and they sort of forget everything that they purported the month before. And so I think for a lot of these Pride festivals, it feels like these were fair weather commitments. And so it wasn't really about the cause, it was about what was popular. And currently it's deeply unpopular, or it can be deeply unpopular to sign off on something like a Pride festival if you're worried about funding or public perception as a big corporation.
Okay, before I hear from our fellow panelists, do you think, Maleeha, there's anything that these type of organizations, Pride and otherwise, can do, should do, might do to, I guess, to plan better?
Yeah.
Realistically.
Yeah. So some of them are setting up GoFundMes. Some are they're kind of requesting public support. But I didn't realize this. Trans Pride Seattle does not take corporate sponsorship at all. They rely on small donations, grants, community support, unions, local businesses. And so there are festivals that do it. That's just not how some of these bigger ones have operated in the past, but it is possible.
Oh. Okay, I got one more question. I said I was done. Does it mean, to anyone here, are we assuming that a smaller budget necessarily means a worse Pride Parade or Pride Festival?
I mean, that's something that's interesting. I don't want to make a blanket statement, but I would imagine that there are ways to still celebrate Pride and appreciate Pride and enjoy it without necessarily having to rely on huge corporate sponsorships every year. It obviously funds a lot of the fun and the fanfare, but I think there are probably ways to enjoy it without all of that.
Anyone else?
I think it's incredibly well said, Maleeha, and that articulates sort of the broader value proposition and the challenge. But we're also living in a time where it's sort of the reality check around a lot of nonprofits in the climate and the environmental sector, a lot of other basis, you sort of can see that struggle from a funding point of view. And that's private sector, it's public sector, and there's a lot of disequilibrium in the world. And, I also sort of just wonder if, their fundraising locally is impacted by just the broader sense of whether a celebration, a parade itself is the expression, is the moment. And I just mean that at a sort of a deeper level of the world is showing up right now. And it's hard to feel a sense of celebration being front and center in terms of how people are feeling about life. I don't mean that there's this dark cloud over everything. I just mean that I wonder in some of these nonprofit funding areas whether that's something that's galvanizing companies' willingness to fund as well. There's just a reality check to their philanthropic contributions right now.
Bill, do we cover it? Okay. Yep. By the way, regarding a couple of these issues, I heard this is just one listener, a transgender woman who listens to the show I've spoken with before. And for one thing, she said, I'm paraphrasing, I don't use the LGBTQ, and there are many more letters and all that. She says, I call it the queer community or the queer and trans community. And also she says, DEI, which we mentioned as well, this is part of the, the Trump administration kind of war on DEI. She says, I don't like that phrase. It's vague. It's complex. I just say, and she does a lot of public speaking and talking to legislation, city councils and whatnot. She says, I just use the phrase liberty and justice for all. That sums up, quote, the trans agenda, the pride agenda, the Black Lives Matter agenda, the women's agenda, and in fact, the whole of the progressive agenda. And what problem does the side aligned against us have with liberty and justice for all? So that's what Eve wanted to say. Okay, another item before we take another break on Week in Review. We have been following this. Now we're going to talk about another aspect of the queer community, because there's this beach in Seattle, which has for decades been known for nude sunbathers and queer community. And it's also become, especially for some of the neighbors who don't like it, way too known for illegal behavior and lewd behavior. We've talked about this. In fact, the last time you were here, I think, Bill, we talked about this.
We did.
We even went so far as to sing about it. At Denny Blaine, there are some neighbors taking photographs to stop the sexing and the scandal that it brings. And suddenly the mayor's cell phone rings. Can't you do some things? Buy some swings. Denny Blaine, protect your ears and shield your eyes. Okay, you get the idea. That's
That's amazing.
I've shielded you from the rest of it. But yeah, so this has been an ongoing saga. And this week, some people who live in the Denny Blaine neighborhood sued the city, saying that the city is allowing, quote, criminal and uncivil behavior that includes public masturbation, public sex, and other types of indecent exposure, drug use, unlawful public nudity, environmental damage to the shoreline, and scofflaw parking that prevents fire trucks and ambulances from reaching neighborhood homes. Okay, so that's a lot, but in this phrase, criminal and uncivil behavior, uncivil seems subjective to me, so let's talk criminal behavior. Maleeha, what is unlawful public nudity?
Any type of nudity is allowed in Seattle as long as it doesn't cause, and I'm quoting, affront or alarm. So I think you're right. There is some subjectivity to it. So you can be naked. You just can't bother someone. And so in researching a little bit, KUOW actually published something a few years ago. Gave a few examples. So being naked is legal, but if you do something nefarious, then it's not okay. So you can nefarious. And so I think public flashing or, bothering someone, doing something that makes them uncomfortable, that is where you get into dicey territory. But just being naked, sunbathing, something like that is fair game.
Yeah. Then I would think there'd be the question of whether you're getting in someone's space or just being in a position where you can look away, you can look or not look. I really don't know what apparently some of these neighbors and their attorneys have collected, photo and video evidence, and they're trying to get this lawsuit seeks for the city to commit more resources to stopping the list of behavior that I described.
Yeah, it's this interesting dichotomy too of, a shared space and who is allowed to use it and what is allowed in that environment. And the people in this neighborhood would argue it's an affront to their, I don't want to quote that, but it is an infringement on what they are seeing, and it's disturbing what they're witnessing. But then, like you mentioned, this is a space that has long been very queer friendly. And so these are people who don't feel like they have other spaces to just kind of exist as they would please and do something that is legal, which is be naked.
But we're not talking about legal activity. We're talking about masturbating in public.
Well, on the list was criminal and uncivil behavior, but on the
KUOW TV spot, and the only thing I know is what I saw on the TV spot, but they went down and they actually filmed not just one, but numerous events.
Right.
And so this isn't just hanging out in the nude and offending some neighbors. This is a park that appears to be, at least from that one television bit of coverage, out of control.
Well, do you think, Reuven, any reaction?
Well, I mean, for me, it's very philosophical or theoretical for all of us, and it's very real for people who live there and for people who are utilizing that space, right? And so on sort of all sides. So I just have a deep sense of sympathy for the neighbors, because it's, probably 7 by 24, or it's, at night, and, it's your home. And if it's right next to it, I mean, there's a deep sense of impact. So I just think there's a difference between theory and reality. And I assume that they put a lot of effort into the collection of evidence before they dropped a lawsuit like that. So I think that, it's not unreasonable to follow our laws and, to follow it in a way that is respectful of the community.
Well, that's what I want to ask about. I'm curious if you think how solid a case they have in the lawsuit, and then if they can force the city to commit more resources to stopping these behaviors, does the city get sued because people use illegal drugs or flash or masturbate or what have you in downtown Pioneer Square, ID, Capitol Hill, U District? Or is this, does it have to do with who's complaining? There's sort of an implication that, well, these neighbors, they're pretty rich, but I don't know what goes into whether the city can be forced to, in any neighborhood, commit more resources until what? Until there's no law breaking, or what's the standard?
Yeah, I think, obviously wealth is a huge part of this conversation. The person who has been named numerously is Stuart Sloan, who owns U Village, and he's able to text the mayor directly and complain about this. He can privately fund a playground, which is not in the works anymore, but at one point was. I think there are people who are complaining, but also have the means to complain and actually see a lawsuit through. And so this happens all over the city.
All over the country.
All over the country.
Yeah.
If it's not happening at Denny Blaine, it's going to happen somewhere else. And that somewhere else may not have the same response because there may not be the same resources. Not to be reductive, but I think that's a huge part of this conversation is wealth.
I think ultimately your point is right, that there's going to be a sense of vulnerability for the city taxpayer. If the data and the evidence is shown in a case, regardless of sort of the outcome, if the city will be seen as liable at some point. I mean, our tort laws are written in ways that are very beneficial to the public payout, and we're one of the highest payout states in the nation in terms of liability of the taxpayer. And that happens at the local, county, the state level. So I just think the central point of the vulnerability, ultimately, if they don't do something, is probably going to fall on the public sector.
But does it fall differently from if people are complaining about, you have not stopped the law breaking at 12th and Jackson or whatever? Is it any different?
I don't know. I just know that the vulnerability to lawsuits for the public sector is really substantial. If there's evidence and data and it's ongoing, and they probably have a legitimate case if that the city isn't managing its responsibility in a way that is ongoing and persistent, et cetera. I'm just saying, theoretically, there could be pretty substantial vulnerability for the taxpayer.
Okay. Well, my responsibility is for taking a break so we can come back and wrap up the show, get at some other things that happened this week, and hopefully give you something to smile about. We'll be right back.
KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham.
Support for KUOW comes from Third Place Books. Journalist Malcolm Harris discusses his new book, What's Left? 3 Paths Through the Planetary Crisis, Sunday, April 27th at 7 p.m. More information at thirdplacebooks.com.
Hey, I'm Joshua McNichols, co-host of KUOW's economy podcast, Booming. On the latest episode, Trump's tariffs are meant to protect American industry. What does that mean for our iconic Pacific Northwest businesses? And is anything really local anymore? Listen to Booming on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for KUOW comes from Fred Hutch Cancer Center, where collaboration between clinicians and researchers gives patients advanced, personalized treatments for their cancer. This relationship can help make life beyond cancer a reality. Learn more at fredhutch.org. Look beyond.
KUOW's Week in Review here. I'm Bill Radke with Maleeha Syed from Cascade PBS, with former Port of Seattle Commissioner and Tacoma Tribune columnist Bill Bryant, and Earth Finance's Reuven Carlyle, who's a former lawmaker, and a couple of just some quick Trump news that could affect us here. The Trump administration apparently has reversed its policy on revoking visas of international students, including UW and Seattle U, and some local students report seeing their status reappear in the federal database. Another note, some federal judges blocked the Trump administration's move to cut off funding to school systems with DEI programs. And Washington's one of those states that resisted that federal order, where you had our state superintendent of public schools saying that we're complying with the law, we like our DEI programs. And then one more, a federal judge said the Trump administration cannot withhold money from sanctuary cities like Seattle over their immigration enforcement policies. So all of this stuff is in the courts. You know, it could change next week, but we'll see all that. I got a quick correction from a listener named John, because on my last show we were saying that REI was disavowing its endorsement of Trump's Interior Secretary, and we discussed that. And in the process, I said, yeah, I don't think, we were talking about changes at REI, and I said, I don't think they're teaching classes anymore. And John writes in and says, they mostly stopped the expensive guided trips. They actually do still hold classes, and you can find those at their website. So thank you, John. The bridge to Mount Rainier that is nearest to Seattle is permanently closed, Bill. Support columns starting to buckle at the bridge over Carbon River.
Yeah, it's a huge issue for communities that rely upon tourism and hikers and people who want to access that side of the mountain. The other access points are now being restricted and are under reservation systems. So this is seriously going to impede our ability to access the national park. And the Department of Transportation is saying it's an emergency closure. It's an emergency closure, and that it's gone so bad that they have to close it, but it's not a surprise. I mean, we have known for years that this bridge is a problem. And it's not just that bridge. In Washington, we have over 400 to 500 bridges that are structurally deficient. Again, it kind of goes back to the very beginning. We're spending an awful lot on curtains and letting the foundation deteriorate.
Well, that doesn't make me smile. So did anything at the end of the show here, did anything make you smile this week, panel?
SIF just released their lineup.
Remind listeners who don't know.
The Seattle International Film Festival. And so they just released their lineup, and I'm putting in a plug. One of my coworkers, Sarah Hoffman, has a documentary there, and it's called Wolfland, and she's just looking at the wolf population, and I'm actually not going to explain it further because I would not want to misrepresent it, but you should go see it.
No spoiler alert then. Okay, wolves. Anything else to smile
Yeah,
at?
Greg Scruggs, Seattle Times, has a great story in yesterday's paper. The Lewitt Tier Trail, a mountain biking trail, 197 miles long from Packwood all the way down to the Columbia River around Mount St. Helens, is open. And it's a new trail. It's part of the 5,000-mile British Columbia to Mexico mountain biking trail, and a big important link in Washington State will be available to mountain bikers this summer.
Nice. It's a good sunny day to tell people about that. New trail, Wolfland. What about you, Reuven?
And this week, a lot of high school seniors have gotten their college notifications, including my youngest daughter, who got hers. And it's just so fabulous to see the high school seniors making their final. A lot are going to college, not all, but many are. And to see that sense of life transition and that excitement, both online and in relationships, where they're thinking about what's next and making those decisions as they get ready ready to graduate. And you can just sort of see it in the air if you are anywhere near high school students, that's just a fab with the combination of that and the sunshine of spring.
Yeah, my daughter graduates in about a month or so too, so I'm in that. My smile is a new because speaking of our kids, my kids are old enough now that I'm back to thinking, what do I want to do this weekend? Right? Me, my wife, my friends, not just my kids. And it's like KUOW's new podcast is just for me. Meet Me Here, it's called, a guide to art shows and concerts and author talks and geeky get-togethers. And the other day they did an episode on our monthly art walks, so most famously Pioneer Square at Capitol Hill. There are others. And one of the hosts, Jeannie Yandel, KUOW's, who I adore, she was talking to this artist about, well, you can go to these on these art walks and talk to the artists and the art dealers in these galleries and pubs. And Jeannie admitted, that sounds really intimidating.
I walk into a space, there's really cool stuff hanging on the walls, and lo and behold, the artist is standing before me. And we make eye contact. This is probably fine for you, Tommy. My palms are sweating just describing this scenario. So I'm asking you, how do I engage in conversation without sounding like a total goofball?
Great question. And Tommy, the guest, who's Tommy Gregory, is just a wonderful interview. And we have to go, so I'll let you listen yourself to find out the answer. How do I talk to an artist at an art walk? And they link to other art walks and other stuff going on in the area, the Great Gatsby burlesque version and half-price tickets at Seattle Art Museum. The podcast is called Meet Me Here, and you can get it wherever podcasts come from. And I want to say thank you to my guests this week. Bill Bryant, Tacoma Tribune. You can read him in the Spokane Inlander as well. Former Port of Seattle Commissioner. Thank you, Bill. And Cascade PBS podcast producer, Maleeha Syed. Thank you, as always.
Thank you.
And former state House and Senate legislator. Enjoy the weekend of seeing what the legislature does without you, Reuven Carlyle.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, founder of Earth Finance. And thank you to our whole team here at KUOW, producer Kevin Kniestead, Bernard Willett on the board, social media from Juan Pablo Chiquiza, and more support from Hans Twite. I'm Bill Radke. See you next week.
Welcome to News